you can think of this as a triangle where one of the points is vote for Harris, one of the points is vote for Trump, and the third point is don't vote at all. And what we're trying to do in the conversations is move people from both of the other points, from both voting for Trump and not voting, toward voting for Harris. And most people fall not at any of the extremes or any of the edges of the triangle. Most people fall somewhere in the middle, right? Where maybe they're debating between all three of those options. Maybe they're just debating between two. But once you can identify that, you could move people toward you sort of wherever they start.
Hello, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what is going on in U.S. politics in 2024, and we also care deeply about pastries. Today, we are discussing the ground game in 2024. That is the Trump and Harris get out the vote efforts that are going on right now in competitive states all across the country. This is an area where, shockingly, we actually have some expertise. I have done some research in the past that actually got published on this topic. John has coordinated GOTV stuff in a number of campaigns. We're going to try and get into the questions of, well, first of all, how the two campaigns compare in terms of their ground game efforts, how much the ground game actually matters in the end, how what we're seeing this year compares with past campaigns, and more. John, how does this sound so far?
I think that this sounds great. And I'd love if you kick us off. You're an expert on the political science research. I think Get Out the Vote, as you mentioned, is something that we've both worked on. It's also something that, I think where practitioners use the most political science research. There's a whole organization of folks who try to study this well and to use data-informed strategies. So, I think there's a lot of overlap between sort of your world and my world here. But why don't you just start? I think a lot of people listening to this, probably have canvassed or are going to go out and canvass this weekend, maybe even listening to this on their way to their canvas shift. Talk through, I'd love you to give the listeners just a bit of an overview on what the literature says. Does this make a difference?
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for pitching that here. So political science, and John is absolutely right on this. This is one area where political scientists will sometimes work with campaigns and vice versa because people want to understand what exactly is going on, how effective this sort of thing is. My impression from a lot of political science research collected over, honestly, a long period of time, over many decades, is that canvassing, get out the vote stuff remains one of the most effective forms of campaigning out there. That it's a very costly form of campaigning, like actually training people to go door to door, getting the volunteers to do that. It costs a lot more for each contact with a voter than does, an ad put on TV or pop-up ad on the internet or something else. But it's also by far the most effective. That it's the most likely to turn a voter from one campaign into a voter for another campaign. It's the most likely to turn a non-voter into a voter. So the campaigns really do invest in it. I did some research on this in the 2008 campaign cycle. I was really interested in understanding what the Obama team was doing that previous campaigns hadn't. Mm-hmm. And it really seemed like this was something that Howard Dean was pioneering a little bit in 2004, that ground game had kind of been underemphasized by presidential campaigns prior to that, particularly, in the TV era. And that Barack Obama's campaign really leaned in hard into this. That was a campaign that had netted a lot of money at that point. It had raised a lot more money than the McCain campaign had, and they invested a fair amount of it into building up field offices in the swing states. And they had hundreds of field offices across the country, and they were using those offices to train volunteers and send them out door to door. And I did a study on that, just trying to look at what we could see in terms of in counties where Obama had a field office versus counties where Obama did not have a field office, and then comparing that to counties where John McCain had a field office. It seemed to matter. That is, controlling for everything else, controlling for partisanship and spending and other things. In counties where Obama had a field office, he seemed to do about 0.6 of a percentage point better than in places where he didn't have a field office. Now, 0.6 of a percentage point doesn't sound like a lot, but at least in this study, it suggested that there were some close states and some close counties where honestly that probably made a difference. This study suggested that Obama might not have won in Florida in 2008. He might not have won in Indiana in 2008 if not for those field offices. And, that doesn't necessarily mean he wins the presidential race because of him, but it suggests, it could matter. I did some additional work on that in 2012 with some other political scientists, Lynn Vavreck and John Sides. We found a similar effect, a somewhat smaller effect in 2012, possibly due to the fact that Obama was an incumbent and campaign effects just tend to be smaller when someone's an incumbent. But similarly, like Obama did better in the places where he had a field office. And this was also an area of Democratic strength that Democratic presidential campaigns were just investing more in this than Republican campaigns were. It wasn't that Republicans weren't doing this, but they seemed to do more outsourcing. That, there were pro-life groups that, and church groups and others that were happy to do the field organization, but it wasn't as directly coordinated with the presidential campaigns or with the party. It wasn't as clear how effective they were. It was harder to track. They just, it was harder to find just records of where their offices were and weren't. We saw a bit of a reversal on this in 2020, where the Biden team did not do a field office campaign because of COVID and because Democratic voters did not want people coming to their door. And the Trump campaign was suddenly investing in ground game stuff, and that may have helped the Trump team somewhat. And then we're seeing, there's a bit of a mystery about what it looks like in 2024. The Harris campaign is investing a lot in ground game stuff. And the Trump campaign is doing something a little innovative, not directly coordinated by the campaign, but there's this sort of Trump Force 47 group of volunteers that's trying some untested methods that may be working. But one of the things is that if this stuff is working, it's hard to trace in the polls. Yeah. And you tend to not really know how good it is until after the election. But that's I'm hoping that's enough of a background. How does this comport with what you have seen in campaigns in the past?
I think at the beginning of my career, I was a field organizer. Out in some of these offices, calling up folks, asking them to volunteer. Sort of came up through the ranks of field. So, have a lot of experience here. And usually, what we say in campaigns is that a good field effort can move 1 to 2 points on the margin. Okay. I think there's a lot of evidence that matters more in low salience elections. So primaries where people don't know that much about the candidates, local elections where turnout is really low. A good field effort can make a much bigger difference. Trying to get somebody to vote in a special election when they don't even realize that there's an election in August until somebody knocks at their door matters a lot more than a presidential election where turnout's going to be at a resting level if you do nothing, 75% in some states. But I think a well-funded, well-organized, well-trained effort makes a difference. I do think that it's and you started to get at this. Having a field effort is different than having a good field effort. And, one of the things that I think the research is pretty clear on that I've seen is that the best contacts are either relational, right? Like I know you from school or from church, our kids go to school together, you're my neighbor. Those contacts and those person-to-person conversations are by far the most effective, where I can say, I'm supporting Kamala Harris, or I'm supporting this ballot initiative, or I'm supporting this school board candidate because X, Y, and Z. We know that moves people. The next best is really engaged volunteers who are there because they want to be, who are well-trained, and who look and sound like people in the community. So somebody coming and knocking on a stranger's door and saying, hey, I'm John Hagner. I live on 50th Street a couple blocks away. We're just going around talking about Kamala Harris Day. That's the next best you can do. The worst that you can do is a paid person who may not be very motivated, who's reading from a script, who kind of comes and knocks on a door and says, "Hello, my name is John. I am a volunteer for Kamala Harris. Please go vote today." Right? Like that's a very ineffective contact. So earlier when you said it's expensive, the best field efforts are volunteer, but those are still really expensive because it takes a lot of resources to staff and train and recruit and help and coach and monitor all of those conversations. But I do think that they can make a difference. But to use a sports analogy, this is the equivalent of a goal line stand, right? If you get the ball to the 1 or 2 yard line, a good field effort can punch it in. It's not going to get you from the 50-yard line. A race that's not competitive, a good field effort just won't matter. But right now in this presidential race, these are all field margins. These polls are tied everywhere we look, and I think that as you said, 0.8%. That's the difference between winning all 7 battleground states and losing all 7 battleground states if the polls are to be believed. So I do think it'll make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw there was a headline, I think, in the New York Times just the other day about saying, could Polish Americans spell the difference in this election? It's like, well, yeah, you know what? I mean, and anything that's this close, sure. Why not?
And to the field effort in Pennsylvania, famous Polish American Christine Baranski went door to door in a heavily Polish neighborhood to say, "Hi, I'm Broadway and television star Christine Baranski. Polish people should vote for Kamala Harris." Which, all of the gay guys in my group chats are like, "That's the only reason I would ever open my door if Christine Baranski could be there." And I don't know how that translates to the straight population, but it would work. It would work for the gays.
Okay, this is good. Another thing that has struck me in the past when I've observed and participated in get out the vote stuff is honestly the level of sophistication, particularly in Colorado, which is an all mail ballot. People, the organizers tend to have very up to date information about who has actually mailed in their ballot and who hasn't, and they're not. The effort is not to just send people randomly around through neighborhoods and just drumming up business for their candidate. It's very targeted work. They know who is a likely Democratic or Republican voter. They know who's on the fence. They know whether they've sent in their ballot or not. And they run the numbers on this multiple times throughout the day. And they want to send volunteers to those specific places, making specific appeals to people to actually get them to turn in their ballot and tell them how to go about doing it. And then, once they update the information and they know someone has voted, they don't bother them again. And again, that takes work. That's an investment in staffer time that you just generally won't see from an ad that's just blasted out during CSI or something like that.
And it's also something that takes a lot of time to build up. You mentioned a little bit about how the Trump campaign this year is has outsourced this. I think one of the people who's taken a lot of the lead on the Republican side from the reporting is Elon Musk. But the problem that they have is they don't have this data that you're talking about, right? They don't have the list of the Trump voters. So now he's asking people to sign this petition saying that they support the First and Second Amendment. I have a lot of feelings about that I'll leave aside. But they're trying to build that database in order to turn those voters out. But it's really late in the game, right? That on the Democratic side, this has been a major point of investment since at least 2004. When I started doing it, to build the voter files, to collect all this information, so that when the rubber hits the road, there's a good data source and a good set of tools to rely on. I think one of you described the Trump effort as innovative. I would probably call it untested, because I think I'm very curious to see how good they can be at that kind of really specific targeting.
This is a question I have for you is I've been hearing from students of mine who work on campaigns since 2004, I think, about the VAN, the Voter Activation Network, I think is what it stands for.
That is what it stands for.
Yes. Basically the super sophisticated database containing information about voters and their likelihood of voting and their likelihood of voting Democratic or Republican. And it gets updated with each contact. And this is something that specifically exists on the Democratic side and is for use in Democratic campaigns and has, arguably helped Democratic turnout in several races. And after every election in which Democrats do well, you often hear Republicans saying, wow, we really need to develop a version of this. And there's often something along those lines, but it doesn't seem to continue from election to election. What is your impression about, are Democrats still ahead in this game, or have
Yeah.
Republicans been able to make up for that with money, with new technology, or anything like that?
It's a great question, and I know a lot more about the Democratic side of this than the
Uh-huh.
Republicans. So it's a little hard for me to say like, have they caught up? I will say that one of my claims to fame is that in 2005 I worked at the Democratic National Committee, and my job was to evaluate all of the different voter file softwares out there and decide which one the party should buy for the whole country. And Van was far and away the best. It was being used in Iowa and a couple other states, but hadn't gone national. So when I went through all of them, I was like, well, this one's clearly the one that we should use. So I was there at the birth of this system.
Okay.
And one of the reasons that it's been successful, and lots of people have, all, lots of people will complain about this thing, and there's a lot of valid ones, but it's so much better than what we used to have. But one of the reasons that it's been successful is that it, it's gotten a lot of cooperation, a lot of buy-in, right? That for Van to work well, you need the national party to invest in it. You need the state parties, which own the data, to be good and competent to know what they're doing. You need the campaigns to buy in and say, yes, this is valuable. It's valuable for my race now, but then it's also going to be valuable down the road. You need activists to be willing to use it. You need just a whole level of cooperation that took decades to build. And it's not easy. And every 6 months, parts of that system want to fight with other parts of that system and redefine the relationship and who owns what data and who has access to it. And it's fraught, it's contentious, it takes a lot of people's time, but Democrats have a framework to do it. And I think that one of the things we've seen is Republicans are a lot more internally divided. They're a lot more distrustful of each other. So when Trump came and took over the party, the folks who were Jeb Bush loyalists or whoever were thrown out of and so because the Dems have been pretty stable since 2004, right? Like we haven't seen sort of a major hostile takeover. We haven't seen sort of such a deep divides that we couldn't come back together. I think that that's really helped us keep our data tight. I think what the Republicans have done is they've looked at all of their party institutions are harder to manage, so they've outsourced it, right? That they've Charlie Kirk's organization, has taken over efforts in a couple states. Elon Musk has set up this PAC that he's given tens of hundreds of millions of dollars, lots of money to. And so they're trying to kind of build around the party because they can't build in the party. So I would much rather do it the way that we have. I think it's a better system for the long run. But when Republicans short circuit it, it's easier to throw a bunch of money and kind of catch up as best they can.
Okay. I'm curious your impression of what, to the extent what the Harris campaign has done this year. Like, how does
Yeah.
that compare with the level of field office activity in the Obama campaigns or with the Clinton campaign?
Yeah, so this will get a little bit too in the weeds, and I apologize if anybody is
Okay.
bored by it, but I'll go fast. Before 2008, the presidential campaigns worked mostly through the state parties. So, when John Kerry ran for president, there weren't really Kerry for president field offices. What there were the Ohio Coordinated Campaign, which was a project of the Ohio Democratic Party with the Kerry campaign's buy-in, right? So the organizers, the staff, everyone who was doing this said, hey, I'm here on behalf of John Kerry and the Democratic ticket. It was funded with different kinds of money. It required a lot of people to sort of make plans together. The Obama campaign went a different way where they opened Obama offices, right? That it was the campaign for change. It wasn't coordinated with up and down the ticket in the same way. That continued for a while. The Clinton campaign used the same model, but the Biden campaign said, no, we want to go back to the old coordinated way of doing things. We think it's more financially efficient. It's better politically. But then, as you said, 2020, we didn't really see much field work because of the pandemic. So what was always different about the 2024 plan is that it's been much more closely integrated with the party efforts, right? Like there was never really a plan for first a Biden and then a Harris kind of fully standalone field operation. They wanted to go back to that more closely integrated where, the Alyssa Slotkin campaign in Michigan was doing the same things as the Biden then Harris campaign, where folks were working more closely together, which, as an old school coordinated campaign guy, I think is smart. I think it's good where we combine our resources the best that we can. So, what I think you've seen is a real step up in sort of coordinated side investment. The Victory Fund is doing a lot of great work. They've got a lot of offices. They're out there doing it. I think the other thing that they've done, which I'm really happy to see, is that, when I was coming up as a field operative, they sort of taught us all summer long you do persuasion. You go out and you try to knock on independents and cross-pressured voters' doors and convince them to vote for your candidate. And then sometime in October, you switch. You stop doing persuasion and you start doing get out the vote, where you take the people you identified as supporters and people who you think are Democrats, and you get them, if you think they might not vote, you turn them out. So it's a very different kind of conversation when you switch from persuasion to get out the vote. The problem, of course, is if you spent the summer persuading somebody and then don't talk to them anymore in October, what are the odds that they're going to stay persuaded, right? You will get a lot of backsliding, especially because the Republicans focus on persuasion all the way through the end. So what I think the Harris campaign has done really well on the field side is being double-barreled, right? Continuing to do the persuasion work, continuing to talk to cross-pressured voters, identifying, they believe that there are segments of Republican women, independent women, who they can, who may have voted for Trump in 2020, that they can win. They're continuing to engage on the persuasion side while also doing the get out the vote work. Because I think there's been sort of a realization that the difference between a persuasion and a get out the vote contact is not as sharp as we used to think it was. That in some ways, get out the vote is persuading someone to vote at all. You can think of this as a triangle where one of the points is vote for Harris, one of the points is vote for Trump, and the third point is don't vote at all. And what we're trying to do in the conversations is move people from both of the other points, from both voting for Trump and not voting, toward voting for Harris. And most people fall not at any of the extremes or any of the edges of the triangle. Most people fall somewhere in the middle, right? Where maybe they're debating between all three of those options. Maybe they're just debating between two. But once you can identify that, you could move people toward you sort of wherever they start.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. I'm curious your impression of what is going on the Trump side in terms of GOTV. Now, I've seen a little bit of writing about whatever Trump Force 47 is. I don't have a sense about how well coordinated that is or what they're doing. There was on the New York Times Run Up podcast recently, there was an interview with some of these coordinators, these GOTV folks working, I believe, in Georgia. And it sounded like some of them were coming up with some good arguments for, how to appeal to swing voters, but it didn't sound coordinated. It sounded very entrepreneurial, which, it can work. But I'm curious just how sort of ground up, bottom down this is, what you think.
Yeah, it's definitely outsourced. There's a lot of freelance operators. I think a lot of it is being driven by Elon Musk. A lot of it is driven by Charlie Kirk, who are people with, clear agendas that they're trying to do. In 2004, Democrats tried a large independent field effort called America Coming Together. That was successful in some ways. A lot of really smart organizers and operatives came through it. It was driven in large part by organized labor funding and organized labor expertise. And it worked. It caused some confusion. It caused some trouble. It's a model that Democrats mostly left behind. I'll be curious to see if sort of whatever the Republican Party looks like in 2028, if they would go back to this. Because, there are major financial advantages, right? Like Elon Musk could not write a $75 million check to the Republican Party to fund this, but he can write a $75 million check to America PAC to do this. So,
right.
I understand why they're doing it. It would make me really nervous if I was the Trump campaign. But I'll say, one of the things we know that they're doing is putting a much bigger emphasis on early voting on the Republican side. They, for lots of reasons, didn't emphasize that in 2020. And I think you see in the data coming out of these early voting states that whether it's messaging from the Trump campaign, whether it's these independent groups, we're seeing a lot more Republicans voting early than we did 4 years ago. If I were the Harris campaign, I would assume that it's going to work. And you got to make sure that the plan to beat them on the ground assumes that their efforts are going to be successful and that yours have to even be better. But yeah, I think we will learn a lot in the sort of postmortems in a couple weeks.
Wow. Okay. Do you want to pivot to a discussion of food at this point?
Yeah, let's we've talked enough
Okay.
about of work.
Okay. Okay.
So it is Halloween. This is a little bit different than pastry, but Halloween is coming up. What do you enjoy around Halloween? Do you have a candy preference? Do you bake anything? How do you approach this?
So, a very familiar pattern for me is buying a lot of candy, having maybe 3 or 4 kids come to my door, and then I just eat the rest over the next several weeks, which is fine. And it's always sort of fascinating to me what gets consumed and what doesn't. I'm a big fan of the chocolate stuff, the caramel stuff, particularly 100 grand bars. It's kind of the only time of year I eat 100 grand bars, and I do love them. Also, it's the only time of year I will eat candy corn, probably because it's the only time of year it's actually available in stores, which is, I think, wise.
You can get Christmas candy corn.
It's not the same. What's your take on candy corn, or what do you, or just more generally, what do you like to bake or cook around?
Well,
Halloween?
first, candy corn, it gets a bad rap. I think the candy corn is delicious for about 4 days a year, but then when you want it, you really want it. But you got to get it when it's fresh, right? Stale candy corn, when they try to use last year's candy corn, is terrible. When you get it, it's sort of nice and soft. Oh yeah, you can tell. Yeah, I like candy too much. I told my fiance to buy some Halloween candy for trick-or-treaters and then hide it because I don't need to know where it is. I love a Reese's pumpkin. I think there's nothing better. All of the Reese's cups are good, but the Reese's shapes, when you get the Christmas tree, the heart, but the pumpkin is the best of all of them. There's something about the peanut butter to chocolate ratio is perfect. I also like the fruity Halloween candy. Give me a Starburst, give me a Skittle. I'll be a happy guy.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I will say, well, a couple of things about candy corn. I guess my favorite brand is Brax, and I don't know how to evaluate the others. I always think it's going to be a good idea for me to eat it, and it never works out. I tend to hate myself pretty quickly. I'll finish the bag, but and I always feel like, did it taste better when I was a kid? Has my palate become more discerning since then? Is this about a change from cane sugar to high fructose corn syrup? I feel like something has changed, but I don't know quite what. It doesn't stop me from eating it, of course.
Yeah.
Also, I have feelings about, there's some candy corn bags that have those little pumpkins in them that are made of candy corn material, but they're larger than candy corn. And I always think that's going to be a good idea. And it's even worse than just eating the candy corn.
I love those pumpkins.
Okay.
If they would just sell me a bag of those pumpkins, I would be a happy man. Yeah. It's definitely plastic. I don't think there's anything defensible in them, but it's delicious. And yeah, you're probably right there. That is, as we get older, our bodies fight us more at eating this kind of garbage.
I think there's something in there about the party allegiances we had when we were 15 stick with us throughout our lives. Despite a lot of new information, we'll just keep finding a reason to go back to that.
We just moved into a new house in May, so this will be our first Halloween, and I'm really hoping we get a lot of trick-or-treaters. And we bought enough candy in hopes that we do, but we'll see. One of the nice things about no longer being a field organizer is that I don't have to pretend that canvassing is the same as trick-or-treating, and I don't have to try to convince people to not take their kids door to door for candy, but go door to door for Barack Obama. And I'm looking forward to being able to be at home and give candy to the kids.
I hope you enjoy that. Do you dress up when you do that?
No.
Okay.
One of the excuses about doing campaigns for so long is that I haven't had to make a Halloween costume in a while. So one of these years I'll finally get around to it.
Okay. Thank you for this discussion. This has been great.
Yeah, 2 weeks to go. Make sure everybody gets out and vote.
Yep. Okay. Thank you all for listening. We hope to have a new episode up for you soon. Until then, enjoy your candy and stay safe.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye now. Thank you very much for listening to Power and Flower. This episode was produced by Eli Masket. We will be recording throughout this election season up until the November election.